Is drift the best synth in Ableton Live? Well, of course, best is subjective, but in this video, what I want to do is discuss why I think drift is probably one of the most versatile synthesizers in Ableton Live. So let's dive right in. Now, if you don't know, drift is a synthesizer that was introduced in Ableton Live 11.3, and it is available in all editions of Ableton Live, from light all the way through to sweet, which is one of the first things that makes this synth really, really awesome. But of course, it doesn't stop there. So let's take a look at some of the features of drift itself to get you a little bit more familiar with the synthesizer and showcase to you some of its really cool features. Okay, so first off, let's just get familiar with how drift is laid out and how it works. Here I've got a basic default drift patch loaded up, and by default, it sounds like this. Now, if you're kind of familiar with synthesis, this might be a little bit basic for you, but for those of you who aren't super familiar with how synthesis works, let's just dive through some of the basic parameters and functions of drift first. So here on the left, we have the oscillators of drift, which are the things that make the sound. And we have three different oscillators. Number one here has a few different parameters. We can choose the shape of the waveform, as well as change its octave, its shape, and its level as well. We have similar controls here for oscillator 2, and then we have a third oscillator, which is just a noise oscillator. Now, by default, when you load up drift, both oscillator 1 and oscillator 2 will be turned up. So let's just actually turn off oscillator 2 by clicking on this button here, and now we're only hearing the output of oscillator 1. Which by default is a sawtooth wave. We can change the waveform here, of course, by selecting the waveform from the drop-down menu, but what's cool about drift are, aside from the normal basic waveforms of sine, triangle, sawtooth, and pulse and square, we have these other two waveforms here, which are kind of more like analog-y style waveforms. So let's select this first one, and let's bring up the level of this oscillator just a little bit. And the first thing that I want to draw your attention to is this little oscilloscope down the bottom, which allows us to see a visual representation of what the waveform of the oscillator section actually looks like, which is fantastic for learning and also just getting a sense of how your oscillators are interacting with one another. Now, as well as having these different shapes, this first oscillator also has this shape parameter, which does different things depending on what the oscillator waveform is. For example, let's take a look at what it does to this particular waveform by looking at the oscilloscope as I change the shape parameter. And if we choose another waveform, let's say the sawtooth wave, or the pulse wave, we can start to see how we can already get some pretty cool sounds just with the first oscillator. And of course, we can also layer these three oscillators together, so I can engage oscillator 2 again, which we can see by default plays an octave below. Let's maybe change this to the third waveform, put it to the same octave as the first oscillator, and just detune it slightly. And introduce some noise. And every single time we introduce an oscillator, we can of course see the resultant waveform in the oscilloscope, which again is really cool. The next section is the filter section. And this is just a section of two different filters. We have a low pass filter here controlled by the frequency control, and then a high pass filter. The low pass filter has the cutoff frequency and then the resonance control as well. And we can see a visual representation of this filter in the center as soon as we start clicking around in the filter section. Now, by default, envelope 2 is actually going to control the filter, so I'm just going to remove this by double clicking on this frequency mod, and also remove the pressure modulation by double clicking there. We also have two different types of filters that we can choose between. And these different filter types are actually outlined quite nicely in the manual, so if you'd like to learn more, I'll leave a link down below. But we can switch between these two different types by clicking on this type button. We have type number 1 and type number 2. But the two things I think are really cool about drift's filter are, number one, that there is an inbuilt kind of filter drive based on the level of the oscillators. For instance, let's turn off oscillator 2 and oscillator 3 here, the noise oscillator, and reset our filter all the way open and reduce the resonance here. Maybe just to make it a little bit less harsh, let's reduce the cutoff frequency a bit. And as I start to adjust the oscillator level, we get some different kind of saturation depending on how loud the oscillator level is going into the filter. So below 0 dB, we kind of just get the basic waveform. But as I start to approach 0 dB, we start to get some saturation on the wave. We don't see this in the oscilloscope, but you can hear it, particularly if I set the oscillator to something like a sawtooth wave. And then we kind of transition into a bit of a second stage of saturation as I push this closer to 6 dB. Which is really nice for that kind of analog warmth. Now, another cool thing about the filter section is that we can actually bypass the filter independently for different oscillators, which isn't something that's available in all other live synthesizers. For instance, if I want oscillator 2 also on, but I don't want that being sent through the filter, I can just untick this little box right here, and now oscillator 1 is being sent through the filter, but oscillator 2 isn't. So next up we have the modulators section, and modulation is probably one of the best things about Drift and what makes it a really versatile synthesizer, and I'll come to those different points later, but for now let's just take a look at our basic modulators. We have an envelope here, which number 1 controls the amplitude of the synthesizer, so how the level of the sound changes over time. We have basic attack, decay, sustain, and release controls. Envelope 2 here is a basic mod envelope, which we can kind of map to most parameters inside of Drift. And then we have an LFO with basic rate and amount controls, as well as a few other goodies in here, including some really cool different shapes, which we'll come to in a moment. And then there's also a really simple modulation matrix, if we click on this tab here, which allows us to map 3 different things to 3 different places inside of Drift. But again, we'll come back to this shortly. Lastly is the global section, which allows us to control some various parameters of the synthesizer, but namely the Unison modes. By default, it's loaded up onto the poly Unison mode, which allows us to play up to 32 different voices or notes at once. We also have 3 other Unison modes. If I click on this drop-down menu, we have mono, stereo, and unison. Mono only allows us to play a single note at once, but we can stack up to 4 voices per note. It's really good for those kind of thick analog sounds. The stereo mode creates copies of these voices and pans them to the left and right speakers to create a wider sound. And then the 4th Unison mode is unison, which applies detuning to these different voices for that classic kind of stacked unison effect. And for each of these unison modes, we have up to 32 voices, which is really nice. But the main thing about this unison section is the drift parameter, which is of course the namesake of Drift. And what this parameter does is apply randomization to the pitch and the filter frequency of every single voice, which is what allows us to get some really interesting characteristics from this synthesizer. And this parameter kind of controls the depth or intensity of this randomization. And this is particularly noticeable on, say, the stereo unison mode, where if this drift control is down at 0, we get a much more kind of nearly pure sound. And then the more intense we make this drift, we can really start to hear that kind of weird error in each of the different voices. And a really cool thing that I found out about this drift parameter comes from an interview on CDM with one of the developers of Drift. Whenever you create a new preset or fresh instance of Drift, this instance is randomized with a seed that we call the serial number. When you reload the presets, it also reloads the serial number, so the randomization used when you first adjusted the patch will be restored, so you get exactly the same sound as before. And this randomized aspect of the sound is recalled whenever you reload the patch or share it with someone else. This is really cool because it kind of means that no two two new instances of drift are ever the same, which I really like the idea of that. Okay, so now we have an understanding of how drift works, some of its basic core features, and also some of its cool and unique features. Let's take a look into some of the things that make this synth really special and versatile. By the way, I recently released a bundle of racks called the Simple Bundle, and all the instrument racks in that actually use drift, as well as some of the different techniques that I'm going to be showing you, particularly things like the FM. If you'd like to check out the Simple Bundle, you can find a link down below in the description. So one of the first cool things to note about drift is that we can have the filter self-oscillate. Now, for those of you who don't know what this means, basically it means that the filter itself can generate a tone without any input from the oscillators. Let me show you what I mean. Okay, so here I have a fresh instance of drift. Let's go ahead and turn off all three of these different oscillators here. So now when I play a note, we don't get any sound. However, let's increase the resonance all the way up, and we can see it goes all the way up to 1.01. Let's turn off again this envelope 2 modulation and this pressure modulation. And now as I play a note, take a listen to what starts to happen as I adjust the frequency control. We can get a tone even though we don't have any oscillators running through this filter. And what's even cooler is that Drift's filter has this inbuilt key tracking, which allows us to basically track the position or the cutoff frequency of the filter based on the incoming note. So the way that Drift's filter works is by doing this around 440 Hertz. So let's set our filter frequency to 440 Hertz, increase this key control here all the way up to 1. And now whenever we send Drift a MIDI note, the filter frequency will change based on the incoming note. Now, it's worth noting, of course, that this does work in both filter types 1 and 2, and the sound also follows the amplitude envelope. So I can increase the attack, increase the release, etc. And just to show you that this is actually in tune, let's add a tuner after the drift here, and let's send the instrument a C note. And we can see that we're mostly getting a C note here. It's a little bit out of tune, but if we change this back to type 1, we can see that we're basically in tune now. And as you probably noticed there, one really cool thing about this is that it's actually polyphonic. So we can actually play multiple notes at once using this filter technique, which is super cool. And it even follows the Unison mode. So if I go ahead and switch the Unison mode here to stereo, increase the spread, we can get a really cool wide pad sound. Increase the drift. And one final thing we can do with this is, of course, start to send some oscillators through this. Particularly if we start to send the noise oscillator through this, we can get a really nice sound. So let's turn on the noise oscillator and start to increase the level of this. Put some reverb and delay on this sound and you're good to go. Next up, let's take a look at probably the most powerful and coolest part about Drift, and that is its modulation capabilities. For such a simple synthesizer, Drift can do a lot with its modulation. So when it comes to modulation in Drift, you will notice a few different places that kind of have the ability to just by default have a modulation source mapped to it. We can map it to the filter shape here, to the pitch, the filter frequency, and also the LFO amount here. Now, if you're familiar with synthesis at all, that's fairly self-explanatory, but what's really cool about envelope number 2 is that we can actually switch it from an envelope to an LFO. So let's go ahead here and map the envelope 2 to the filter frequency just by increasing this amount. Let's reduce the sustain here. And we start to get that kind of pitch drop sound at the beginning of the note. But now let's click on this little button right here underneath number 2, and that will switch envelope number 2 from an envelope to an LFO. And this LFO is a little bit different because it doesn't offer us traditional shape controls. Instead, we have a tilt and a hold control. The tilt control allows us to kind of tilt this triangle waveform either to the right or to the left. And this hold control allows us to kind of flatten out the top of this LFO. And of course, we get the rate control as well, which has some other cool options that I'll talk about in a moment. But as well as envelope 2 being able to be an LFO, we can also make the LFO an envelope. So let's go ahead here to the LFO section and click on this drop-down menu for the different shapes. And you can see the last two shapes here are linear envelope and exponential envelope. And this turns the LFO from a normal kind of periodic waveform into something that just occurs once. So let's go ahead and set this to linear envelope to start with. And now let's map this LFO to, say, the level of the noise. Let's go to our mod section, go to this first option, set this to LFO, and set this LFO to control the noise gain at 100%. Go back to the LFO section, and you should hear now that the noise fades away after a period of time. And we can change the rate of this based on this rate control. Now, before we get into the different rate modes for the LFOs, I want to talk about one more thing in terms of drift's modulation, and that is that we can modulate the same parameter with the same modulator twice. So let's load up a default drift again here, turn off oscillator 2, so we just have oscillator 1 going on, and set oscillator 1 to a sine wave. Now, we can't do this with every single parameter, but if we go down to the pitch mod, for instance, we can see there's two different options. We can actually modulate the pitch with two different modulators. However, these different modulators can be the same modulator. So let's go ahead and modulate it with envelope 2 to create that pitch drop again. So let's increase this pitch mod to 100%, reduce the sustain. And now, with the second pitch mod, we can also select envelope 2 and start to increase the amount here. And that will now apply envelope 2's modulation twice to the pitch of this sound, giving us a much wider range when it comes to this pitch modulation. Now we can do this for the pitch, we can do this for the filter frequency, and we can also do this for any of the options that we can find in the modulation matrix, the oscillator 1 gain and shape, oscillator 2 gain and detune, and all of these other controls here as well, which is really, really cool. Now, of course, not everything inside of Drift can be modulated with Drift's internal modulation, but it does open up some really awesome possibilities once you start to dive in under the hood. So lastly, my favorite thing about Drift are the different LFO rate modes, particularly the 1-to-1 mode, which allows for frequency modulation. So let's once again load up a default Drift patch. And now we can come to this LFO section here, and we can see where it says rate, we have a few different options. The first option here is to change the rate in hertz. So let's go ahead and change the depth of the LFO to the pitch of the oscillators. And now we can change the rate all the way from 0.17 hertz up to 1.7 kilohertz, way in the audio range. Which already sounds pretty cool in and of itself. We also have the ability to change this rate to milliseconds, sync it to the tempo of our session, and then we also have this 1-to-1 mode, which allows us to set the rate of the LFO to a ratio of the frequency of the notes being generated by the synthesizer. And if we have the LFO mapped to control the pitch, like we do at the moment, this effectively results in FM, or frequency modulation. And then as I change the ratio, we get some really wild tones. And of course, because this is just a standard LFO, we can change the shape to something other than a sine wave. We could go to a sawtooth wave, for instance. Or a sawtooth wave down. Or if you want to get really crazy, you could even go to like a sample and hold. But that starts to get really kind of sound designy and weird. So let's set this back to a sawtooth wave. And now to control the kind of envelope of this frequency modulation, we could actually go to the amount control here and set the modulation for this amount to envelope 2, set it to 100%. And now we can control the kind of envelope of the FM by using envelope 2. Now these LFO rate modes are obviously available in the envelope 2 when it's in cycle mode as well. But of course, we don't just have to map this to the pitch. We can also map it to, say, the filter frequency. So if we go here to the filter frequency mod, set this to LFO. Or we could even map it to, say, the oscillator shape here. It can get pretty crazy and hard to control, but it is a wild amount of fun, and there is so much you can do with modulation inside of Drift once you start to understand how it works. And so if you weren't already using Drift, I hope this video at least inspired you to start diving into what this synth can do. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to click the like button, subscribe if you're new, and leave a comment to let me know how you're going to use Drift in your next track. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you all in the next video.